The sound that ripped through the stale air of the rusty mug wasn't just cotton tearing. It was the shredding of a carefully built lie, the violent end of a self-imposed exile. Kaylin K. Washington stood dead center on the sticky floor, her bare back a canvas under the single buzzing fluorescent light. And etched across her dark skin in stark black ink was the one symbol that stopped every goddamn heart in the room. The unmistakable eagle, anchor, and trident of a Navy SEAL. Silas Reaper Kane's Bowie knife, the one he'd been cleaning his filthy fingernails with seconds before, clattered from his suddenly nerveless fingers. His face, a mask of arrogant cruelty a moment ago, collapsed into something raw and primitive. It was fear. Pure, unadulterated terror. The air grew thick enough to choke on, heavy with the stench of cheap beer, stale smoke, and shattered machismo. 40 pairs of eyes were glued to the black woman who had just detonated their entire understanding of the food chain. What the hell are you watching right now? You're watching the moment a predator became prey. Before we dive into the blood and chaos of what comes next, do me a favor. Obliterate that like button down below and subscribe, because you are not going to want to miss a single second of this. And comment, hell yeah, if you're ready to see a bully get exactly what's coming to him. Now, to understand why a single tattoo could turn a bar full of hardened bikers into a room of terrified statues, we have to rewind the clock. We have to go back 8 months, to the day Kaylin Washington first walked through these doors, a ghost carrying secrets heavy enough to sink a battleship. 8 months prior, Kaylin polished a pint glass with a sniper's focus. Her movements were a study in brutal efficiency, economical, precise, and utterly devoid of wasted energy. It was a discipline learned not in a bartending school, but in kill-or-be-killed environments where a single sloppy movement could mean a flag-draped coffin. Every 30 seconds, like a deeply ingrained tick, her eyes performed a silent, sweeping patrol of the room. Exits first. Always the exits. Then hands. What were they holding? Where were they resting? Then faces, cataloging intent. It was a habit seared into her very DNA by years spent in places where the price of complacency was paid in blood. At 36, she was a deceptive 5'7", her lean, wiry frame a deliberate illusion of fragility. It was a deception she had cultivated, a weapon in its own right. Most people, the civilians she now served, never saw the real her. They never noticed how she instinctively positioned herself with a solid wall to her 6, eliminating blind spots. They never clocked the way her fingers, when picking up a bottle or a knife, would unconsciously find its perfect balance point, testing its weight as a potential weapon. But Alistair Al MacLeod, the 68-year-old owner of the rusty mug, saw it all. From his perch behind the ancient cash register, the grizzled Marine Corps veteran, who'd left pieces of himself in the jungles of Vietnam, recognized the ghost in her eyes. He'd seen it in the mirror for 50 years. He hired her 8 months ago on the spot, no questions asked. He understood, in a way only another soldier could, that the most important parts of a person's story are rarely found on a resume. They're written in the scars they carry, both visible and unseen. The rusty mug was, to be generous, a shithole. The leather on the stools was cracked and peeling like sunburnt skin. The wooden tables were a chaotic roadmap of carved initials and cigarette burns, and the jukebox in the corner was trapped in a time loop, endlessly cycling through the same 20 classic rock anthems. But for Kaylin, the small Spartan apartment above this dive bar had become more than a home. It was a fortress of solitude, a forward operating base in her lonely war against the past. It was her sanctuary from a world that had trained her to be a weapon, then discarded her when the war was over, not knowing what to do with its own finely honed instruments of violence. Sleep was a luxury she could no longer afford. Every night, or rather every morning, The attack came with punctual cruelty. 3:17 a.m. on the dot. She would jolt awake, not in her bed in Oak Haven, Colorado, but in the suffocating dust of the Syrian desert. The phantom weight of her MK-18 carbine would press into her shoulder, a ghostly appendage she could feel more clearly than her own limbs. The acrid, metallic smell of burnt steel and something sickeningly sweet would fill her nostrils, so real it made her gag. In those first disorienting seconds of consciousness, her right hand would instinctively reach for the spot on her chest where her rifle sling used to lie, only to find the knotted, raised tissue of old wounds, a permanent reminder of her failure. She had perfected the art of muffling her screams into her pillow, a silent, agonizing ritual. She had learned to time her ragged breaths to the distant rumble of passing semi-trucks on the highway, using the sound to anchor herself back to reality, to drag herself out of the burning desert and back into the quiet darkness of her suburban hideout. The oppressive heat of the Colorado summer beat against the tavern's grimy windows, a pale imitation of the inferno she carried inside her. Still, Kaylin wore long-sleeved flannel shirts for every shift, the thick fabric a shroud for the story inked across her skin. The regulars, a mix of local construction workers and weary 9-to-5ers, learned quickly that she was a woman of few words. She communicated in curt nods and economical gestures, pouring drinks with a disciplined grace that some mistook for unfriendliness. But it wasn't unfriendliness. It was the hypervigilance of a creature that had survived in the wild and couldn't remember how to be tame. When she stood at the bar, slicing limes for the evening rush, a hush would sometimes fall over the nearby patrons. They'd watch the way she held the paring knife, not like a bartender, but like a surgeon or a soldier, like someone who understood that the only difference between a tool and a weapon was intent. "That girl? She's haunted," Al had confessed to his wife one night over dinner. His wife had simply nodded, her eyes sad. She knew. Some ghosts wore dog tags, and every Friday night at exactly 9:15 p.m., the ghosts of the Rusty Mug scattered, replaced by demons on iron horses. The low, guttural rumble of a dozen Harley-Davidson engines would vibrate through the floorboards, a seismic warning that shook the very windows in their frames. This was the signal. Kaylin would watch as the bar underwent a chilling transformation. Laughter would die in throats. Couples would suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be, their eyes wide with a fear they tried to hide. Even the most belligerent drunks would sober up with astonishing speed, fumbling for their wallets to settle their tabs and evaporate into the night. Friday nights belonged to the Serpent's Coil Motorcycle Club. It had been this way for 4 years, ever since their leader, Silas Reaper Kane, a man whose soul was as black as his leather vest, decided that Al's humble bar would be a new revenue stream. It was protection money, a classic extortion racket for a threat that only they posed. And every Friday, Al would perform the humiliating ritual. He would count out $600 in crumpled 20s and 10s, his gnarled, arthritic fingers trembling as he slid them into a plain white envelope he kept ready under the counter. It was his insulin, the dose he had to take to prevent a much more violent sickness. Kaylin observed this grim transaction from her post behind the bar, her jaw clenched so tight she could hear her teeth grinding, but her hands remained rock steady. She had learned the hard way in the field that survival was often a brutal calculus of choosing which battles not to fight. That resolve had been pushed to its absolute limit last week. Silas had made an example of Mr. Park, the elderly Korean man who ran the electronics repair shop 3 blocks down. His protection payment was 2 days late. Kaylin had been out back, dumping a bin of empty bottles, when the screaming started. She saw it all from the alley, She saw Silas drag the old man into the street, saw his steel-toed boot connect with Mr. Park's ribs with a sickening wet thud. Again and again and again. The rest of the Serpent's Coil had laughed, filming the brutal assault on their phones like it was a cheap form of entertainment. Every cell in Kaylin's body had screamed at her to intervene, her muscles coiled, her training surging to the forefront of her mind, 1,000 lethal techniques begging to be unleashed. But she had forced herself to stay in the shadows, to melt back into the darkness of the alley. She had forced herself to remember why she was here, in this town, in this life. She couldn't afford to be noticed. She couldn't afford to be found. The guilt from that moment of inaction had become a fresh wound, another scar layered on top of a soul already crisscrossed with them. Later that night, as she was sweeping up broken glass inside, she'd bent down, and the collar of her shirt had shifted. It was just for a second, but it was enough for Al to see the jagged, puckered scar that ran along her jawline, a brutal souvenir from an ambush outside of Manbridge that she usually kept carefully concealed beneath her hair. He hadn't said a word. He didn't need to. Their shared glance was a conversation in itself. Now, the familiar, ominous roar of the motorcycles grew closer, a promise of impending violence. Kaylin felt that old, familiar tightness constricting her chest, the combat-honed hyper-vigilance that had kept her and her team alive in Syria, now making her hands tremble as she stacked clean glasses behind the bar. Across the room, Al's weathered fingers fumbled as he prepared the envelope of blood money. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met. It was a look of shared understanding between two warriors from two different, forgotten wars, recognizing the same invisible weight on each other's shoulders. But something was different tonight. Kaylin could feel it. The air in the bar tasted wrong, metallic and sharp, like the moments before a lightning strike, the taste of ozone, blood, and spent gunpowder. Her instincts, the ones that had screamed at her to dive for cover seconds before an RPG struck her vehicle, were now screaming at her again. A silent, internal klaxon she had learned, through immense pain, never to ignore. What was about to happen would not just break her 8 months of carefully constructed anonymity. It would shatter it into a million irreparable pieces. But Kaylin didn't know that yet. All she knew, as the first biker kicked open the tavern door, was that her hands had suddenly stopped shaking. And that, she knew from bitter experience, was a very, very dangerous thing. A dozen Harleys, chrome gleaming menacingly under the streetlights, swarmed the parking lot like a pack of mechanized wolves. Silas Kane dismounted first, a mountain of a man at 6'3", wrapped in cracked leather and simmering rage. His arms, covered in a tapestry of prison tattoos that chronicled a life of brutal violence, seemed to carry a weight of their own. He didn't open the tavern door. He kicked it, the wood splintering around the lock as it slammed against the interior wall. The sound was a declaration of war. He savored the effect. The immediate, terrified silence, the way every customer's gaze immediately dropped to the floor, to their drinks, to anywhere but him. Behind him, his second in command, a brutish man known only as Cutter, and 10 other members of the Serpent's Coil fanned out, forming an intimidating perimeter. They moved with a practiced arrogance, their presence sucking the very oxygen out of the room, transforming the cozy neighborhood bar into a claustrophobic cage. Silas cracked his scarred knuckles, a sound like dry branches snapping, that made Al visibly flinch from behind the bar. "Well now, Alistair," Silas's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, dripping with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from a lifetime of never being told no. He grabbed a nearby bar stool, not to sit on, but to hurl across the room where it smashed into the jukebox, silencing Creedence Clearwater Revival mid-guitar solo. He surveyed the remaining few terrified patrons with a predator's satisfaction. Looks like you had a busy night. A real profitable night. Which makes me think, you've been holding out on me, you old bastard. Al's hands trembled so violently he could barely push the white envelope across the polished surface of the bar. $600. Money that was supposed to go to his wife's medical bills. It felt like he was handing over a piece of his own soul. That's everything we agreed on, Silas. The full amount. Same as always. But Silas wasn't interested in agreements tonight. He was bored. And when Silas was bored, he craved the intoxicating taste of fear. Agreements change, old man, he sneered, stepping closer. Cost of doing business is going up. Inflation, you know? My boys here, they got expenses. From now on, it's 1,000 a month. The words hung in the air, a death sentence for the struggling bar. Al's face went pale. 1,000? Silas, I just can't afford that, please. The slap was shockingly fast. Silas's open palm cracked across Al's cheek with a sound that echoed through the silent room. The old man's head snapped to the side, and a thin trickle of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. Cutter let out a low, appreciative laugh, a guttural, ugly sound. The other bikers began to move through the bar with deliberate menace, swaggering between tables, knocking over half-full glasses, grinding their muddy boots into the floor. It was a show of dominance, a way of marking their territory. Silas grabbed a full bottle of whiskey from the top shelf, unscrewed the cap, and began pouring the expensive liquor slowly onto the floor, his cold, dead eyes locked on Al's. "Clean that up," he commanded. His gaze then slid past the bleeding old man and landed for the first time on Kaylin, who had stepped forward with a bar towel, her face an unreadable mask. "Well, hello. Didn't know Al was hiding such a pretty little thing back here." Kaylin moved with the fluid, calculated grace of a predator. She knelt to soak up the spilled whiskey, but her movements were strategic. She deliberately positioned her body to create a barrier, a shield between Silas and the vulnerable, dazed Alistair. Her motions were too smooth, too controlled for a simple bartender, and even through his haze of arrogance, Silas noticed. "What's your name, girl?" he asked, the unspoken racial slurs hanging heavy in the air between them, thick and poisonous. Kaylin said nothing. She continued to methodically wipe the floor, her focus absolute. Her silence wasn't fear, it wasn't submission, it was an assessment, it was strategy. Silas's heavy boot came down hard on her hand, pinning it to the sticky, whiskey-soaked floorboards. Pain, sharp and blinding, shot up her arm. "I asked you a question," he growled, pressing down harder. "You deaf or just stupid?" Still, she didn't speak. But a single tendon in her neck stood out, a taut cable of pure, contained rage. Al, trying to regain his footing, stumbled forward, his voice raspy. "Her name is Kay. She just works here, Silas. This is between us. Leave her out of it." Chushwarsum. What makes a person with the kind of training Kaylin Washington has so lethally dangerous? It's not just their skill with weapons or their physical prowess. It's their patience, their inhuman ability to absorb pain, to endure humiliation, to wait for the perfect, single microsecond to strike. But Silas Kane had never faced a true warrior. His entire life had been spent preying on civilians, on people too terrified to fight back. He mistook her control for weakness. "Kay." Silas rolled the name around in his mouth as if tasting it. "Pretty name for Al's little chocolate drop." The slur finally landed, a verbal grenade intended to shatter her composure. But Kaylin's only visible reaction was a slight, almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. She rose slowly to her feet, the soiled towel still clutched in her hand. For the first time, She met Silas's gaze directly. Her eyes were calm, steady, and held a depth of cold fury that made even Cutter shift his weight uneasily. "Ooh, this one's got some fire in her," Silas grinned, a grotesque expression that showed off his yellowed, crooked teeth. "I like that. Makes it so much more satisfying when I finally break them." He turned his attention back to Al, shoving him hard. The old man, off balance and weak, crashed backward into the shelves of liquor bottles behind the bar. The sound of shattering glass was explosive in the tense silence. Whiskey and blood mingled on the floor. And in that instant, something fundamental shifted in Kalen's posture. It was subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye, but to a soldier, it was as loud as a gunshot. It was the change from a passive to an active stance. It was the disengaging of a safety. "That's not how you solve problems," her voice cut through the chaos. It wasn't loud, but it had a quality of command, of pure, unshakable authority that sliced through the tension like a scalpel. Every single person in the bar, biker and patron alike, froze. Silas's face cycled through a series of emotions: genuine surprise, then dark amusement, and finally incandescent rage. Did this bitch just tell me how to run my business?" Cutter and the others instinctively closed ranks, forming a tighter, more menacing circle around them. Hands began to drift towards the hilts of knives and the bulges of concealed firearms under their vests. But Kalen didn't move. She didn't even blink. She just held Silas's murderous stare with a terrifying calm, the kind of calm that comes only from having faced death so many times you've come to find it boring. "I said." Silas took a step forward, his massive frame looming over her, trying to intimidate her with sheer size. "Do you have any idea who I am?" What was about to happen would do more than just settle a debt. It would transform the Rusty Mug from a forgotten dive bar on the edge of town into a crucible, a battleground where the true nature of strength would be tested. And it wouldn't be measured in muscle or numbers or the size of your knife. It would be measured in the courage to stand your ground when every instinct tells you to run. Silas Kane charged like a rabid grizzly bear, 250 pounds of pure, unrestrained fury aimed directly at the woman who had dared to defy him. It was a move that had ended 100 bar fights before they'd even begun. But it wasn't a bar fight Kalen was in. She was in the crucible. At the very last possible microsecond, she pivoted on the ball of her left foot, a movement so fluid and fast it was almost a blur. She didn't just dodge him. She used his own massive forward momentum against him. A subtle, guiding pressure from her hand on his back was all it took to send him careening past her. He crashed headfirst into a heavy oak table, which exploded into a shower of splinters and shattered legs. The other bikers, seeing their leader momentarily down, surged forward as one, but they stopped dead in their tracks when Kalen, in a single, seamless motion, snatched the jagged, broken neck of a whiskey bottle from the floor. She held it not with the clumsy grip of a desperate brawler, but with the practiced, lethal familiarity of someone who had wielded far worse weapons in far darker places. "Stay back," she commanded, and the sheer, unadulterated authority in her voice, that deep, bone-rattling certainty, was enough to make even the hardened Cutter hesitate. Scrambling to his feet, his face a mask of purple, humiliated rage, Silas lunged again, this time with a wild, desperate roar. Kalen didn't dodge. She met him head-on. Her smaller frame seemed to absorb his massive impact, redirecting his force with a series of precise, devastatingly effective techniques that had no place in a civilian world. An elbow strike, delivered with pinpoint accuracy, found his solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs in a painful gasp. A perfectly timed knee connected with the perineal nerve cluster on the outside of his thigh, sending a jolt of pure agony through his leg and causing it to buckle. Suddenly, the giant man was staggering, off balance, his mind unable to process how this smaller woman was dismantling him. "You little—" His huge, meaty hands finally found purchase, grabbing the front of her flannel shirt, fingers digging into the fabric like claws as they grappled in the center of the room. Kaelin twisted, trying to execute a brake hold, but Silas's grip was like iron. With a final furious roar, he yanked with all his might. The sound of tearing cotton split the air like a rifle shot. Time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing to a crawl. As Kaelin's shirt ripped open down the back, the full canvas of her skin was exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of the bar. And the story written there silenced every sound, stopped every breath, and froze every heart. It sprawled across the entirety of her back, a masterpiece of military ink, beautiful and terrible all at once. The centerpiece was the iconic Navy SEAL trident, its eagle with wings outstretched, clutching an anchor and a flintlock pistol. But surrounding it was an intricate, detailed mural of her service. A depiction of a C-17 Globemaster in flight, the words, "The only easy day was yesterday," scripted in stark lettering beneath it. Below that, a pair of detailed dog tags were tattooed at the base of her spine, bearing the names of 2 fallen comrades, with the words, "Never forgotten, never forgiven," etched forever into her skin. The bar fell as silent as a tomb. The 40 people still trapped inside collectively held their breath, their minds struggling to reconcile the quiet, reserved bartender with the image of the elite warrior now revealed before them. Even the low hum of the beer coolers seemed to pause, as if paying a moment of silent respect. Silas Kane's hands dropped limply to his sides, his mouth hanging open, making a series of small, gulping motions like a fish pulled from the water. Cutter, who had done a single, unremarkable tour in the army as a supply clerk before being dishonorably discharged, recognized the trident instantly. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white beneath his unkempt beard. "Holy shit," someone whispered from a dark corner. "She's a SEAL." The words rippled through the stunned crowd like a shockwave. A Navy SEAL. The most elite, most feared special operations force in the entire United States military. Warriors so secretive, so highly classified, that most of their missions would never be declassified. And not just a SEAL, but a woman SEAL, one of the first, a pioneer in a world of hardened men. The quiet bartender who served them beer had walked through hellfire they couldn't even begin to imagine. But Silas Kane had built his entire identity, his entire criminal empire, on the foundation of never backing down. His pride, a toxic and fragile thing, wouldn't allow him to process what he was seeing. His confusion curdled into a desperate, uglier emotion, mockery, born from a place of pure, gut-wrenching fear. "Oh, this is rich," he sneered, though his voice was thin and cracked, betraying his terror. "Al's got himself a broken little toy soldier. What's the matter, sweetheart? Still hear the bombs go off when you try to sleep?" He began to circle her now, a hyena testing a wounded lioness, trying to find a weakness. "All that fancy ink, that just means you were there. It doesn't mean you were any good. Bet you got your whole team killed, didn't you?" Kaelin stood motionless, her exposed back ramrod straight, her hands loose at her sides. But her breathing had changed. It had become shallow, rapid, the first sign of the storm breaking inside her. "How many of your buddies came home in boxes because you weren't fast enough? Weren't strong enough?" Silas pressed on, sensing he'd struck a nerve. He saw the subtle tremor start in her hands. "Do you see their faces when you close your eyes at night? Do their parents know you're hiding out in this shithole, pouring drinks instead of—" How many times can a warrior's heart break before the pieces fuse together into something unbreakable? Kaylin had been asking herself that question every single night for the past 2 years. And now, standing in the middle of this pathetic little bar, she finally had her answer. The flashback hit her not like a memory, but like a physical blow, a secondary detonation from an IED buried deep in her soul. It was sudden, violent, and absolute. One moment she was in Colorado, the next she was back in the choking dust and chaos of a narrow street in Syria. The taste of cordite and blood filled her mouth. The explosion had been catastrophic, flipping their MRAP like a child's toy. Petty Officer Reyes was screaming, a sound she would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life. His leg was just gone. She remembered dragging him behind the smoking husk of the vehicle, the air alive with the snap and crack of enemy gunfire. She remembered the searing, white-hot pain as shrapnel tore through the flesh of her shoulder, finding the one small gap in her body armor. "Stay with me, Reyes. You stay with me," she had screamed, her hands slick with his blood as she tried to apply a tourniquet. But there were too many wounded, not enough hands, not enough time. The medevac was taking heavy fire, unable to land. She'd had to make choices that night. Unspeakable, impossible choices about who to save first, who had the better chance. And those choices, the faces of the men she couldn't save, had followed her home. They were the ghosts that haunted this bar. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably now, the familiar, hated tremor that signaled the PTSD was winning, that the monster was breaking free of its cage. Silas saw it, and his cruel smile returned. He thought he'd found her breaking point. He thought he had won. "There it is," he crooned, his voice dripping with sadistic glee. "The crazy finally showing through. What are you gonna do, hero? You gonna cry? You gonna run away and hide like you ran from that firefight?" But Kaylin wasn't running. She was recentering. She was transforming. The shaking in her hands stopped as abruptly as it had started. It was replaced by something far more terrifying, a profound and absolute stillness. The stillness that precedes the hurricane, the dead silence before the thunder. "You know nothing about sacrifice," she said, her voice low and steady, yet it carried the weight of every flag-draped coffin she had ever saluted. "You know nothing about the crushing weight of carrying other people's lives in your hands, about being forced to make impossible choices in impossible situations where there are no good outcomes." She turned to face him fully now, her eyes no longer haunted but blazing with a cold, righteous fire. She was no longer hiding. She was no longer ashamed. "You want to know what this tattoo really means?" she asked, her voice ringing with clarity. "It means I have walked through hell and I have come back. It means I have paid prices you can't even begin to comprehend for the very freedoms you piss all over every single day." A murmur went through the crowd. Understanding was dawning on their faces like the sun rising after a long, dark night. Al, using the bar for support, pulled himself to his feet. There was still blood on his chin, but his eyes shone with a fierce, defiant pride. "That's enough, Silas." Then another voice, from a man in the corner. An older man who, it turned out, was a Marine Corps veteran who'd served in Desert Storm. "You're talking to a goddamn American hero." Suddenly, other people found their voices, their courage ignited by Kaylin's defiance. "She was serving our country while you were cooking meth in your trailer," a woman shouted. Even Cutter looked deeply uncomfortable, his worldview fracturing before his eyes. But Silas's rage, cornered and humiliated, had nowhere to go but forward. His hand flashed to his belt, and suddenly a 6-inch serrated Bowie knife was in his fist, its edge gleaming in the dim light. It was a blade that had ended arguments and lives before. I don't give a flying fuck what uniform she wore, he snarled, his face contorted in a mask of pure hatred. In here, I'm the only authority that matters. What happens when an unstoppable force of pure, ignorant rage collides with an immovable object of courage and conviction? The rusty mug was about to find out. The knife sliced through the air, aimed directly for Kaylin's throat. But her hands, her body, moved with a speed that was not quite human. It was muscle memory forged in the crucible of 1,000 life-or-death training scenarios, honed to a razor's edge in the chaos of real-world combat. Her left forearm shot up, deflecting Silas's wrist with a sharp, percussive block that sent a shockwave of pain up his arm. Simultaneously, her right hand snaked around his, her thumb and forefinger finding the precise pressure point in his wrist that made his fingers spasm involuntarily. The knife clattered harmlessly to the floor. She didn't stop there. Continuing the fluid, devastating motion, she used his own forward momentum, twisting her hips and dropping her center of gravity. It was a textbook hip throw, executed with such brutal perfection it would have brought a tear to her hand-to-hand combat instructor's eye. Silas, all 250 pounds of him, was lifted off his feet and slammed onto his back on the hard floor. The impact drove the air from his lungs in a pained, whooshing gasp. Before he could even process what had happened, Kaylin was on him. Not with fists or fury, but with the cold, detached efficiency of a professional. She had him in a control hold, a knee pressed into the small of his back, his arm twisted behind him at an angle that neutralized him completely without breaking any bones. It wasn't the brutal street fight chokehold he deserved. It was the measured, calculated restraint of a soldier. I don't want to hurt anyone, she said, her voice calm and even, though her breathing was heavy from the exertion. Her knee pressed just hard enough into his spine to keep him pinned, immobilized. But I will always protect the people I care about. That's what we do. That's what the uniform means. The atmosphere in the room had transformed. It was electric, as if everyone had woken up from a long, collective nightmare. Cutter took a hesitant step forward, but it wasn't to help his fallen leader. Instead, he reached down, picked up the fallen knife, and tossed it behind the bar, far out of reach. It's over, Silas, he said, his voice quiet but firm. You lost. Kaylin's act of courage was a spark that ignited a wildfire. The Marine veteran from the corner stood up, his back straight. Then another man, a former Army Ranger, stood up beside him. A young woman whose brother was currently serving in the Air Force stood up. One by one, 30 ordinary people got to their feet, forming a silent, protective wall, a human barricade between Kaylin and the remaining members of the Serpent's Coil. This is our town. This is our bar, Al said, his voice now strong and steady, filled with a renewed strength he hadn't felt in years. And she is one of us. The remaining bikers looked at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. Their primary weapon, intimidation, was useless against a community that had just found its backbone. Silas, pinned to the floor, struggled and spat curses, his threats turning into pathetic, impotent whimpers. But Kaylin held him fast, applying just enough force to restrain, never enough to injure. The wail of sirens cut through the night. Someone had made the call during the fight. Detective Sarah Kim of the Oakhaven Police Department entered first, her hand resting on the grip of her service weapon, followed by 4 uniformed officers. She had been trying to build a solid case against Silas Kane and the Serpent's Coil for 18 months. But every time she got close, witnesses would recant, their fear of reprisal outweighing their desire for justice. Tonight was different. He pulled a knife on her, Al said immediately, pointing a trembling but steady finger at Silas. We all saw it. A chorus of agreement rose from the patrons. "He's been extorting me for 4 years," Al continued, the words pouring out of him now that the dam of fear had broken. "$600 a month." "More from others," the Marine veteran added. "He shook down Mr. Park at the electronics shop last week." Then came the biggest betrayal. Cutter stepped forward, and Silas's eyes widened in disbelief. "I'm done with this shit," Cutter announced, his voice loud and clear. "Detective Kim, I'll tell you everything. The drug running, the extortion racket, where he keeps the ledgers, all of it." A stunned silence fell over the room. "You goddamn rat," Silas wheezed from the floor. Cutter just shook his head, a look of profound disillusionment on his face. "I followed you because I thought you were strong, Silas. But tonight—" He gestured toward Kaylin, who was now helping a shaken Al back to his feet. "She showed me what real strength looks like. It's not about beating on people who are weaker than you. It's about protecting them. It's about standing for something, even when it costs you everything." 2 other members of the Serpent's Coil nodded in agreement, slowly backing away from their leader, their allegiance broken. Detective Kim's body camera recorded it all as, one by one, patrons and even former bikers lined up to give their statements. The security footage from Al's system, though grainy, clearly showed Silas's initial assault, the knife attack, and Kaylin's controlled defensive response, combined with hate crime charges for the racial slurs, federal extortion charges, and a mountain of testimony. Silas Kane was facing a very long time in a very small room. His family's money could buy him slick lawyers, but it couldn't erase video evidence and 30 unshakable witnesses. Within hours, the story became a local legend. By the next day, it was a national phenomenon. The headline, "Female Navy SEAL Veteran Defends Bar Owner from Racist Biker Gang," went viral. It was shared by military advocacy groups, women's empowerment organizations, and civil rights activists. News vans with satellite dishes sprouted like mushrooms in the parking lot of the Rusty Mug. But Kaylin Washington wasn't hiding anymore. She stood in front of the bar the next morning, not in a flannel shirt, but in a simple black tank top. Her trident tattoo was visible for the entire world to see. She stood tall, looked directly into the cameras, and spoke her truth into a dozen microphones. "For 2 years, I tried to hide who I was. I thought the things I'd been through, the scars I carried, made me weak. I thought I had to disappear. But I was wrong. Real strength isn't about hiding your wounds. It's about using the strength they gave you to stand up for what's right, even when you're terrified, even when your hands are shaking." The clip of that interview was viewed over 50 million times in less than a week. A GoFundMe, started by the Marine veteran to help Al repair the bar, raised over $100,000. Veterans organizations from across the country reached out, offering support, resources, and solidarity. Kaylin had inadvertently become something she never wanted to be. A symbol of resilience, of courage, of the unbreakable spirit of the American warrior. But when a truth that powerful is unleashed, whose life does it change the most? Sometimes it's not the person you'd expect. 3 months later, Silas Kane was sitting in a federal penitentiary, his appeals exhausted, his empire of fear reduced to a 6-by-9-foot cell. His family had disowned him. The Serpent's Coil had imploded, its members either arrested or scattered to the wind. Cutter, true to his word, had testified against his former boss, and, in return for a lenient sentence, had started an auto repair shop that exclusively hired and trained at-risk veterans, giving second chances to men and women who, like him, had lost their way. But the most profound transformation had taken place at the Rusty Mug itself. What had once been a dingy, forgotten dive bar had become a beacon. It was now a well-known gathering place, a sanctuary for veterans from all branches and all eras who were wrestling with the invisible wounds of war. Kaylin, with Al's blessing, had started leading weekly support group meetings in the back room. She shared her own raw, unvarnished story of her struggles with PTSD, her survivor's guilt, her long road through the darkness, helping others find the courage to confront their own demons. "I thought I was protecting myself by hiding away," she told a packed room one Thursday night, her voice thick with emotion, but steady. "But isolation isn't safety. It's just another kind of prison cell, one you build for yourself." Al had fully recovered. With the donation money, he had not only repaired the bar, but had renovated it completely. And the first thing he did was hire a lawyer to legally make Kaylin a 50% partner in the business. Together, they had built something beautiful from the ashes of something broken. The ripple effects of that one night spread far beyond their small Colorado town. Kaylin's story, amplified by national media, inspired thousands of other veterans, particularly female veterans who often felt isolated and overlooked, to come out of the shadows and seek help. She testified before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C., speaking with raw honesty about the unique and often unaddressed challenges facing women in the military and veteran communities. She began consulting with the Department of Veterans Affairs, helping them redesign their PTSD treatment programs to be more effective and accessible. But most importantly, she kept her Thursday night shift tending bar at the Rusty Mug. Because she understood that sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is to simply show up day after day, scars and all. "Every time I put on this tank top and walk behind this bar," she told a documentary filmmaker, her trident tattoo a proud declaration, "I'm sending a message to every veteran out there who's struggling in silence. I'm telling them that it's okay not to be okay. It's okay to be wounded. It's okay to ask for help. What's not okay is giving up on yourself. What's not okay is fighting alone." Her phone buzzed constantly now. Texts from veterans on the brink of suicide, emails from media outlets, calls from politicians, but she always made time for the broken warriors who found their way, like pilgrims, to the front door of the Rusty Mug. 8 months had passed since the night that had ripped her life apart, and then pieced it back together into something stronger. Kaylin Washington stood behind the bar, but she was a different woman entirely from the ghost who had once hidden in long sleeves. She wore a black tank top, her seal trident a badge of honor, not a secret to be concealed. Her movements were confident, her smile genuine as she mixed drinks for the bustling Thursday night crowd. The bar itself was reborn. Fresh paint, new furniture, and, on the main wall, a wall of honor covered in photographs of local men and women in uniform, past and present. Al worked alongside her, no longer just her boss, but her partner, her mentor, and the father figure she had never had. The clientele had evolved from a handful of lonely drinkers to a thriving, vibrant community. The tables where bikers had once plotted their crimes were now filled with veterans and their families, their laughter and camaraderie a testament to the healing power of connection. The bell above the door chimed, and a young man entered. He couldn't have been more than 22, but his eyes held the haunted 1,000-yard stare of a man much older. He moved with a hesitant, almost fearful gait, scanning the room, his body language screaming of hyper-vigilance, habits Kaylin recognized as intimately as her own heartbeat. He approached the bar with the cautious, deliberate steps of someone navigating a minefield. "Excuse me." His voice was barely a whisper. Are you Kaylin Washington?" Kaylin set down the glass she was polishing and gave the young man her complete, undivided attention. "I am," she said, her voice warm and inviting. "But you can call me Kay." The wave of relief that washed over the young man's face was so profound it was almost heartbreaking. "My name is Leo," he stammered. I was Army infantry. Just got back from Afghanistan 6 months ago." Leo's story tumbled out of him in broken, painful fragments. The IED, the ambush, the friends he couldn't save, the nightmares that made him terrified of closing his eyes, the bottle of pills in his glove compartment that he'd been staring at for the past 3 days. "I saw your story on the news," he said, his eyes welling with tears. "My sister sent me the link. I've been sitting in my car in your parking lot for the last 2 hours, just trying to find the courage to come inside." Without a word, Kalen came around the bar, gently placing a hand on his shoulder and guiding him to a quiet booth in the corner. "8 months ago, Leo," she said, sitting across from him, her gaze direct and compassionate. "I was right where you are. I was hiding from my own shadow. I thought my scars, the ones on the inside, made me weak. I thought they were a sign that I had failed." She rolled up the sleeve of her shirt, revealing the gnarled, puckered shrapnel scars that marred her forearm. "But these aren't signs of failure, Leo. They are proof of battles survived. They are maps of where we have been." Leo unconsciously traced a hidden scar on his own arm. "I can't stop seeing their faces," he whispered, "the ones who didn't make it back." Kalen reached across the table, her hand covering his. It was a connection from one warrior to another. "They never leave us," she said softly. "But we have a choice. We can let them drown us, or we can choose to honor their memory by living, by fighting for the peace they never got, by helping the next soldier who comes home broken." Al appeared at their table with 2 steaming mugs of coffee, his presence a silent, comforting reassurance. He gave Leo a nod of deep, unspoken understanding before returning to his post behind the bar. "You know the most important thing I learned?" Kalen continued. "True strength isn't about how well you can hide your wounds. It's about having the courage to show them so that others know they're not alone in their fight." She gestured around the bustling bar, where several small groups were engaged in deep, earnest conversation. "Half the people in this room tonight are veterans or their family members. We've built something here, Leo, a safe harbor, a place where you don't ever have to pretend that you're okay when you're not." For the first time since he walked in, a tiny bit of the tension left Leo's shoulders. "My family, they try, but they don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "They just want the old me back, but that kid, he died in a dusty field in Kandahar." Kalen's response was forged in the fires of her own hard-won healing. "You can never go back, Leo, but you can go forward. And the good news is you don't have to do it alone anymore. Have you ever wondered if the darkest, most painful moments of your life could somehow become your greatest source of strength?" Kalen Washington had found the answer to that question. And now, her new mission was to pass it on. The transformation of the rusty mug became a national model. What began as one woman's defiant refusal to be a victim had blossomed into a grassroots movement. They now hosted multiple support groups a week, organized job fairs for veterans, and even provided free family counseling sessions with volunteer therapists. The Rusty Mug model was being replicated in a dozen other cities across the country, with Kalen and Al consulting via video calls, sharing their blueprint for building communities of healing. Detective Sarah Kim was a regular now, not as a cop, but as a friend. She walked in one evening, a wide grin on her face. "Kay, I've got incredible news," she announced, her voice filled with excitement. "The grant proposal we submitted to the Department of Veterans Affairs, it was approved. They're funding a national rollout of the program. They're calling it the Beacon Initiative." The entire bar erupted in cheers. Kalen felt Al's weathered hand on her shoulder, squeezing it with pride. "From one small act of courage," Kim continued, her eyes shining, "you've created a nationwide movement. They want you to head it up, to be the national coordinator." Leo, who had been listening from his usual seat at the bar, looked at Kalen with pure awe. "You did all this, Kay." Kalen shook her head. a humble smile on her face. "No," she corrected him. "We did this. Every single person who chooses to stand up instead of hide, who decides to share their story instead of suffering in silence. They are all a part of this." Just then, her phone buzzed. A Washington, D.C. area code. "This is Kaylin, Washington." There was a pause, and then a familiar voice from the news. "Miss Washington, this is Senator Patricia Williams, the mother of Petty Officer Reyes. I'd like you to testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee. I want them to hear, from you, what needs to be done to fix our broken system for veteran mental health care." Kaylin's hand trembled slightly as she held the phone, old habits dying hard. But her voice when she spoke was as steady as steel. "I'll be there, Senator." As she hung up, Al raised a glass. "To Kaylin, Washington," he roared, "who taught us all that true strength isn't about running from your demons, but in turning around and facing them head on." Glasses clinked throughout the bar, but Kaylin's mind was already on the next mission. There were still thousands of Leos out there, sitting alone in their cars, hiding in the dark. Her war wasn't over. It had just moved to a new battlefield. The final image was one of profound, simple beauty. Kaylin stood behind the bar she had helped build, her trident tattoo visible, a symbol not of violence, but of survival and hope. She was surrounded by the community she had fostered, the family she had chosen. Leo was now co-leading the new arrival support group, paying forward the gift of hope he had been given. Above the door, a new, hand-carved wooden sign hung proudly. "The Rusty Mug. All are welcome. No one fights alone." Because sometimes, the most powerful revolutions don't begin with armies or governments. They begin with the quiet, unshakable courage of one person who refuses to hide their truth any longer. Her phone buzzed again. A text from a number she didn't know. "Is this Kay? My buddy gave me your number. I'm not doing so good." It was another veteran in crisis, another chance to turn pain into purpose. She began to type her reply without a moment's hesitation. "This is Kay. You're not alone. I'm here. Let's talk." The cycle of healing continued, each act of courage creating ripples of hope that would touch countless lives for generations to come. True strength, she had finally, truly learned, wasn't measured in the battles you won, but in the fellow warriors you helped bring home from the war inside. What you just saw was more than just a story. It's a testament to the power of resilience and community. There are heroes walking among us every day, fighting battles we know nothing about. So be kind, be aware, and be supportive. If this story touched you, please hit that subscribe button, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because you never know whose life you might change. Until next time, stay strong, and remember, no one fights alone.